their crime in very specific, narrow terminology. Consider, for example, the interview of a suspect who was being questioned about selling drugs to an undercover police officer.
Crystal, if you sold any drugs to anyone last Saturday night, our investigation will clearly indicate that. So let me ask you, did you sell any drugs last Saturday night?
Look, I did not sell 1.5 pounds of marijuana to anybody last Saturday night.
Of course, what she's not denying is that she may have sold 1.5 pounds of marijuana on Sunday night and 2 pounds on Saturday night. One of the things to remember is that some guilty people don't have the confidence to make an outright denial. So they want to imply a denial through an evasive response. The following 3 scenarios show examples of evasive responses to specific questions that the suspects hope the interviewer will take as a denial.
Were you involved in that robbery?
Honestly, man, this is the first time I heard anything about it.
Are you telling the truth about what happened?
Well, why would I risk my reputation making up something like that?
Crystal, did you leave your home at all last Friday night?
I don't know why you have such a hard time believing me.
Another type of verbal response that many guilty people utilize when they answer questions includes qualification phrases. Phrases such as, to the best of my knowledge, at this point in time, as far as I can recall, are often used by the guilty to give themselves an escape hatch. So if later on their statements are contradicted, they can blame it on a faulty memory instead of having to face the fact of an outright lie. So listen for the qualification phrases to questions of a specific nature. Now, there is a different way that some guilty people may qualify their answers, and that is through the use of generalized responses.
Jim, where were you last Saturday night?
I always spend Saturday watching TV.
Who were you with that evening?
You mean last Saturday night?
Yes.
I was gonna have a friend over, but, she called up and said she couldn't make it.
Okay, what time did you go to sleep Saturday night?
I always go to bed, sometime after the news, around 10:30.
Okay. Did you leave your apartment at all Saturday evening?
Well, sometimes I go out and get some smokes on Saturday night, but I bought a carton, so I didn't need to buy any.
Now, this subject robbed a gas station at 9:30 on Saturday night, but during this interview we just saw, he didn't lie to any of the questions because all of his answers were generalized. Some of the key words to listen for in generalized responses are always, typically, as a matter of habit, generally. As an example of this, let's look at how he answered the first question.
Where were you last Saturday night?
I always spend Saturday watching TV.
Now, that was a perfect example of a generalized response. The guy may have watched TV for an hour Saturday night and then left at 9:15. We don't know. He never said. In fact, there are 2 questions he never answered during the interview. One, who he was with that night, and secondly, whether or not he left the apartment at any time. Now, to try to lend credibility to the evasive responses he did give us, he tried to logically explain why he wasn't with his girlfriend and why he didn't have to go out for cigarettes that night.
Who were you with that night?
I was gonna have a friend over, but, she called up and said she couldn't make it.
Okay, did you leave your apartment at all Saturday evening?
Well, sometimes I go out and get some smokes on Saturday night, but I bought a carton, so I didn't need to buy any.
The behavior of a deceptive person is usually the result of internal anxiety and conflict they feel when they're lying. The greater the level of stress, internal anxiety, or conflict that the person feels when they're answering questions, when they're lying, the more it needs to get out and shows itself in the behavior. One of the factors that impacts on the level of anxiety a person feels is their perception of the consequences. For example, if you're interviewing someone on a homicide where they have potential life imprisonment, even potential death facing them, they're going to be very concerned, very anxious, and they're going to feel a lot of stress during that interview. Another factor that impacts itself on the behavior displayed by an individual is their level of social responsibility, what they have at stake, what their values are. Many juveniles have not established a sense of social responsibility or internal values, so that when they lie, there's no conflict. They don't feel uncomfortable with their lie. As a result, when you're interviewing juveniles, be very cautious in evaluating their behavior. They can look very credible and believable when in fact they're lying to you. Another group of individuals that you have to be careful with in reading their behavior are those who are chemically dependent. A suspect who's dependent on alcohol or drugs may have developed an apathetic attitude towards life in general, and consequently, they don't experience any conflict or internal stress when they're lying to you. Another factor that we need to consider in evaluating behavior symptoms are cultural differences. In some cultures, it is considered impolite to establish eye contact with an authority figure. In some cultures, they teach restraint, not show your emotions during stressful events. Whereas in other cultures, they may advocate a very aggressive, a very dominant response when you're in a stressful situation. Consequently, when you're interviewing somebody who is from a culture you're not familiar with, be very careful in evaluating their behavior. Keeping these factors in mind, juveniles, people who are under the influence of alcohol or drugs, cultural differences, keeping those in mind, we can still evaluate and categorize verbal behavior as consistent with a truthful person or a deceptive. Now, most truthful people, as we have seen, will answer questions in a sincere, direct, spontaneous manner. There's no unnecessary delay or hesitation. They use realistic words. They don't qualify their responses. And when they answer questions, they are consistent with their responses because they've only got one story to tell, and it's the same time after time, no matter what our inquiry is. On the other hand, deceptive suspects may delay their response or repeat the question before giving an answer in order to contrive a false response. They may give an evasive answer that never addresses the actual question they were even asked. Some deceptive suspects tend to mumble or to talk so softly that they can't even be heard clearly, almost as though they're trying to disguise what they're saying, while others may speak at a very rapid pace or display erratic changes in the tone of voice or pitch of their voice. A verbal response coupled with nervous laughter or levity can oftentimes be an attempt to camouflage deception. A deceptive person may try to bolster his or her answers with phrases such as, "to tell you the truth," "to be perfectly honest with you," or, "to be quite frank." More sophisticated liars may use the same type of evasions, but they usually plan beforehand so that their answers include a protective verbal coding. A protective coding could be phrases such as, "at this point in time," "if I recall correctly," or "it's my understanding." Deceptive people use those phrases to give them an escape hatch, as opposed to just verbalizing an outright lie. It should be remembered that verbal behavior should always be viewed and evaluated in conjunction with the person's nonverbal behavior, what they physically did as they answered the question. This next program will focus on that nonverbal behavior.